The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Visit christies.com to find out more about the world's leading auction house since 1766. Auction, private sales, online, art, anytime. Hello and welcome to The Week in Art. I'm Ben Luke. It's Frieze Week in London, yet there's no big art fair at its heart. Can galleries create the usual excitement, and is anyone still buying? There's no Frieze London or Frieze Masters, but it's still officially Frieze Week in London, with exhibitions and events being staged across the city and the now customary online viewing rooms and digital sales platforms. We talked to Louisa Buck about the art around town and to Melanie Gerlis about how the market's faring without the fairs. Later, Linda Yablonsky talks to Theaster Gates about his shows in London and New York. Before all that, the art newspapers launched a new 3-part online live event series which began this week, called New Models for New Times, rethinking the art market in a changing world. The second event in the series, Breaking Boundaries, Local is the New Global, is on the 15th of October, and you can register for this and other online events at theartnewspaper.com/live. Now, as ever, a wealth of shows has opened across London for Frieze Week, and our contemporary art correspondent, Louisa Buck, has been out and about seeing them. I spoke to her about some of her highlights. Louisa, before we start talking about individual shows, I just wanted to get a sense of the mood while you're out and about, because obviously this is normally a time of year when there's manic energy and millions of people from all over the world descend on London. But what's the mood among the galleries and museums that you're visiting?
I think it's very up and down, to be quite honest. I mean, what's quite interesting, of course, you haven't got the international crowds coming in. There are not throngs of people. There is no, I mean, the champagne sales are zero. There's no socialising. So when you go and look at a show, the atmosphere is much more contemplative. People are actually looking at the work, they're talking about the work. There's a sort of rush to kind of, embrace people or say hello and then shrinking back again as one realises that one has to observe social distancing. In the commercial galleries, it varies a lot from quite a sort of casual attitude to really quite a strict one where your temperature's taken as you walk in. So it's mixed, but it is cautious, it is sedate, it isn't frenetically social or indeed social at all, but there is a seriousness where people are actually going to art to look at art.
That's good to hear. Give us a sense of the kind of scope of the shows that you're seeing, because obviously this time of year, normally, again, because the collectors are all here, because museum directors are coming in from all over the world, this is the moment where the galleries choose to show their most high-profile artists, their most ambitious shows. Do you get the sense that that's the case this year as well?
I think they're certainly rescheduled to kind of coincide with an art week in early October. Whether Frieze was going to happen or not when they decided to go ahead with these shows, they didn't know at the time. I mean, the atmosphere, who knows about the buying? But as I said, the looking is there. And I think, people are actually falling upon the looking with great seriousness. I mean, there's the great Bruce Nauman show that's just opened at Tate Modern. I mean, Nauman is, of course, the artist's artist. He is such a genius. It's a great show. It's partnered with the Stedelijk in Amsterdam. I mean, I'd like it to have been the whole of that floor of galleries. Of course, half of it's given over to Warhol, so that's not the case. But actually what's interesting is Nauman kind of haunts Tate. They very cleverly recalibrated it, partly for social distancing, but also, I think, to have Nauman very much within the body of Tate. So on the ground floor, there's Nauman's wonderful repetitive video of him washing his hands again and again. What could be more appropriate? Before you even enter the gallery, his Voices piece, an adapted piece from his Turbine Hall project, you hear strange disembodied voices echoing down the stairwell. Above the actual exhibition gallery entry itself is his great neon saying that the true artist helps the world by revealing mystic truths. Of course, that's sort of deeply ironic. And then in you walk into Nauman's studio, the great time-lapse piece of his studio with cameras scrutinising the space when he's absent from it. So you're immersed in the artist's studio. And of course, so much of Nauman's work is about what the hell does the artist do in the studio? What resources do they draw on? Their body, their immediate things that come to hand. Nauman is the most inventive artist. I mean, one phase in his work, for example, casting the space underneath his chair, is a whole career for the likes of Rachel Whiteread. So you've got this kind of protean feeling. You enter in the studio and then you go through this show with really wonderful installations, but also works that in our febrile, insecure, beleaguered moments really do speak for the times. I mean, Naumann's work is so much about, about duress, about cruelty, about humour, about the body. He casts his own hands in an early work. That takes on new resonance. There's that amazing installation, Anthro Socio, where you've got this bald-headed man, an actor, not Naumann, shouting, "Feed me, help me, eat me, burn me," projected round the walls on monitors, and suddenly you're feeling this beleaguered body is here. So Naumann has taken on new resonance. It's a great show, and it's a great show for our times. He may be a white male, but boy is he an important white male, and I'm very glad that Tate are showing him, and it is their big show for this moment.
Sort of sets the tone in a way, doesn't it? A high watermark for the rest of the shows around town.
Well, yes. They would normally, of course, have the Turbine Hall project at this point, and they haven't. They've still very wisely got Clara Walker's great fountain there, so that has been put in on the back burner. But then another great show that's just opened is Michael Clarke at the Barbican, which is. He's been choreographer in residence for the last 15 years, and he's this great figure. I mean, yes, he's a dancer and a choreographer, but he's also brought together so many cultural forces. I mean, back in the 80s, he was bringing the world of ballet into the world of punk, clubbing, popular culture, LGBT, or queer as we called it then, culture, working with an amazing array of artists, all of whom are very much given the foreground in this installation at the Barbican. I mean, you walk in and there's this amalgamation of several Charles Atlas films about Clarke. It's a multi-screen installation, so you're immersed in the world of Clarke, of him dancing, of him talking, of him socialising, the amazing music that's played, and that's on the ground floor. Then you go up into these various sort of areas of different artists working with Clarke. Of course, you've already seen the great designer Lee Bowery, who gave so much of a look of his work in the films, but you see the costumes, you see Sarah Lucas and him collaborating, so there's a great kind of crossover. And I would say that what's kind of nice is a moment where Lucas, as a room devoted to Michael Clarke, with which Lucas has made a giant sculpture of a sandwich like a plinth, upon which sits a cast of Clarke's headless body sitting on a toilet. And of course out you go to Frieze sculpture, one of the few bits of Frieze that's actually happening, and there is another version of this great sandwich, a cement sandwich in the grounds of Regent's Park. So it's a nice cross-reference from the commercial Frieze that does still exist in an analogue form and the institutional.
That's right. So let's talk about Frieze sculpture a bit. I mean, is it much the same? Is it the sort of only bit of the fair, effectively, that's gone ahead as it normally would do?
Well, yes, and out you go to Regent's Park, and it's a great way, you're socially distanced, provided you're not in a group of larger than 6, and you can see some great sculptures. The Lucas sandwich, as I said, is one of my favourites because it's so democratic. You can climb on it. It sits there, this instantly recognisable icon. Also, a great piece by Gavin Turk, Large Door. He likes a pun. It's a giant bronze open door, which is a great one for people to kind of play with and off, and the different kinds of spatial encounters with that. Also, doors are used in a great piece by Lubena Himid, which is 5 conversations where 5 reclaimed doors are painted with these great stylish women in vivid colours incorporated into the kind of form of the door, so they're kind of interconnecting with each other. There's also a great piece by Rebecca Warren, sort of totemic piece, Richard Long Stone Circle, and a piece by an artist I didn't know, London-based, Calliope Lemos, a giant plait in steel, like a braid of a plait that becomes a huge column like a Brancusi. So there you can actually interrelate with works, in the flesh, eyeball to eyeball, and that's the part of Frieze that's, absolutely as before. But then Frieze has also sort of adapted itself, apart from going online, of course, where you can go into endless viewing rooms, but it's gone to Cork Street. And Cork Street, of course, back in the day, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, when I first started in the art world, it was the epicentre for the art world, Cork Street, the contemporary art world. Then it all went a bit fallow and a bit quiet. Now it's being massively redeveloped. A lot of the galleries have left. But actually now people have come back into town, including the Frieze Live, which is in one of the sort of modern, sort of refurbished ground floor spaces in Frieze. And here it's been set up as the Institute of Melodic Healing, and there are various installations by, for example, Anthea Hamilton, Haroon Mirza, Alvaro Barrington, which will be activated, and live action will take place in Cork Street to a very small audience, but it will all be live streamed. So Frieze has sort have popped into Cork Street, as of other galleries as well. Sadie Cole has a show there, also Listen Gallery, and various others. So Cork Street has become kind of weirdly reanimated by Frieze, with galleries putting almost like booths there. Stephen Friedman, also honourable mention, he's just round the corner in New Burlington Street with a great show of Holly Hendry sculpture, but he's also got a pop-up in Cork Street of Denzel Forrester's enormous, dynamic, glorious paintings of his time in the British School in Rome in the 80s, where you've got sort of, he's known for doing these incredible scenes of dub reggae clubs, and here you've got it sort of taken to an old masterly incarnation from his time in Rome in the 80s. So Cork Street come back to life thanks to Frieze.
That's fantastic. Let's talk about Sarah Lucas's old mucker Damien Hirst, because he's got at his own gallery, Newport Street Gallery in Vauxhall. He's showing a body of work from that first decade, which is, I think, broadly seen as his most successful decade, artistically. What do you think?
Well, it's called End of a Century. It seemed only a matter of time that Damien made this high-end, high-spec gallery that he'd created as a receptacle for his own work. And it's actually, I mean, it might sound rather hubristic to do that, but there are some extraordinary works there. I mean, you can see the evolution of his spot paintings, because there's early painted plates, painted pans, and then painted boxes from the 80s. Also, his collages from really before he was a student even, and when he was really starting out in the early 80s. And so you've got the evolution of his work, and then you've got some great, extraordinary pieces. I mean, there's a sliced shark, which is a slightly earlier one. Many great spot paintings. Then there is the great piece. It's called 100 Years rather than 1,000 Years. It's another version, but it is, to my mind, the greatest Hirst piece, which is the vitrines full of living flies, which is a kind of fantastic memento mori, where they're born, there's a box full of their eggs, they're hatched, they're born, they swarm around, they feed on a cow's head and some sugar, and then they're killed in an insecticutor. But this vitrine is full of these repulsive, buzzing dots of flies, and it is this sort of shortened life cycle. It's a great piece. There's also the enormous sculpture, which sort of Clarion calls the end of the 90s, 1999, him, the vast anatomical child's toy that he's blown up to colossal heights. Another very strange piece is a vitrine full of stuffed animals, faking an auction with a sort of teddy bear auctioneer and little paintings inside saying, art's about life and not about money. But I would argue that actually it's probably interchangeable with him. But I'd never seen that piece before. So it is a kind of early retrospective of his early works, and to my mind the best works, and seeing the evolution of these spot pieces, the spin paintings, the vitrines, all of which are there, is a really interesting thing to behold. And it's for free as well.
I wanted to talk about, you mentioned Hirst's paintings, and that, his commitment to painting was pretty strong right from the start. But we actually began this year on this podcast talking a lot about figurative painting, and it just occurred to me that there is actually quite a lot of figurative painting happening right now in London. So you've seen some of those shows, haven't you?
Well, it's really interesting. And talking of Hirst, one of his absolute old muckers from Goldsmiths, Gary Hume, has a really, I think, wonderful show at Sprute Margars. It's called Archipelago Paintings. And it poses the problem of what does an artist who's a very formal, aesthetic painter do to respond to the current situation? And he's taken two strands of work. One is that he's taken images of schools, bombed schools. When there's a scenario, some atrocity that's happened in a war zone, whether it be Afghanistan, wherever it may be, Syria. Often you see these bombed out schools with terrible scenes of carnage. He takes all the horror out and he just reproduces the decimated school walls with happy children's paintings, happy decor in the background, and abstracts it. And that's one strand. The other strand, the archipelago paintings, are based on the form of the life jacket, the outline, where you've got the sort of over the shoulders and the sort of void for the neck and the head. And so that abstracted becomes a sort of biomorphic form, which it becomes like a sort of an abstract element that he has in these paintings. Some of them, sometimes they're tangled together, sometimes they're more separately construed in these very beautiful aesthetic paintings. But of course what they are these images of horror, of loss of life. The life jacket has become something else altogether. You wouldn't know until you know what they are. But once you do see, he's also made a sculpture out of almost life-sized versions of them, cast in concrete that looks like a modernist sculpture, but it becomes this sort of tangled mass of loss of life and loss of hope. But he also points out that the void in the centre of the life jacket is a bit like the yoni, the kind of female symbol. So it can also be a kind of vacuum and a symbol of life. So these are very exquisite but very sombre works. And the child's paintings on the walls of the devastated schoolrooms are kind of cheerful but with a terrible, vacuous, scary feeling of empty promise. So that's a really interesting series of work. Also, there's works by Dana Schultz, Thomas Dane, big, lumpen, scary figures and creatures, these sort of humanoids that she paints, showing how the use of painting can still render electric emotion. I mean, she's known for the causing the scandal at the Whitney for the Emmett Till painting that she produced of the open casket body of the young boy who was lynched in the 60s. But this shows that she's a serious painter. This is not just about, sensationalist images. This is about really grappling with what paint can be made to say and do. And Christina Karls, also at Pilar Corrès, produces strange, abstracted bodily paintings, showing the experience of inhabiting a body but rendering it in paint. So figurative painting, it's really interesting. I mean, maybe it's because there is a very strong strain in painting in contemporary art at the moment, as the recent Whitechapel show confirmed. Or maybe it's because dealers are thinking it's a safe bet, paintings sell. Who knows?
Well, thank you very much for rounding it all up for us, Louisa. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, without the Frieze fairs, how are galleries and auction houses responding to this moment? Melanie Gerlis is an editor-at-large at the Art newspaper and the art market columnist at the Financial Times. I talked to her about how the art market's getting on. Melanie, the art world tends to have a certain rhythm through the year. We expect certain things to happen in certain months, and it's been the same pretty much for a very long time. That is not happening right now, is it? It's all over the place.
No, exactly. It's chaos at the moment. What we'd got used to are certain events at certain times, and all that was happening were other events were being added. But, your staple fairs and your staple auctions were always around the same time. I think it will settle because we're humans and we don't like chaos, but I don't think for a while. There just always seem to be reasons to do things differently at the moment. So Christie's just held its auction at a different time because of the US elections. We've got Brexit coming, so heaven knows what happens to the February season in London. And then very significantly, of course, there's this virus. I saw a gallerist this morning who said to me, please come to my opening on the 27th of October in London if we're open. So you can't, if we're not in lockdown, you can't even plan for a couple of weeks ahead. I think the calendar is a complete mess. But experiments are coming in left, right and centre. So it's stressful, but it could be an opportunity.
So basically this week, because we've got the Frieze Art Fair and everything else, the auction houses would have had their sales in London, right? But of course, because of the circumstances, because of the pandemic, that hasn't happened. And therefore, there have been auctions that have sort of been global, essentially.
Well, yes, what's happened is the New York auctions, which are meant to be in November, and only for one auction house. So this isn't even universal. I mean, this is what I mean by chaos. It's everyone doing their own thing. But the New York auctions are normally held in November, so Christie's held its auction this week instead because actually it's a New York auction, which was hosted in New York but was virtual. So it's just all a brave new world, as I keep saying.
And you were involved in that, in this sort of new sort of experimental format, weren't you? And I think it does. This is important because it does speak to the kind of ways, because we are now in a situation where the event culture that normally surrounds auctions just isn't possible. So you were involved in a kind of experimental means to try and create a sort of more event-like feel around this Christie's auction, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I was kind of beamed to Rockefeller Center in New York and sat next to someone who was in New York, and we were sat with someone who was 100 yards away from him, but it looked like we were all in the same room. And you're completely right. I mean, events are fun, but they also confer value, which is really important in this world. The added value of owning art are the dinners and the parties and the private views, and people are trying to find ways to create that. I honestly think it's impossible at the moment to replicate. I don't think anyone has managed to. I mean, I had great fun working with Christie's in an alternative reality. And I had people asking me, are you, oh, wow, you're in New York. It's like, no. But I don't think great technology is yet the magic bullet. An auction, in fact, works quite well as a TV show. I mean, they had something like 280,000 viewers over lots of platforms, but that's not the same as buyers. So I just worry that to reinvent the wheel every time, auction, every fair we see online has to have some novelty value to generate this sense of occasion. And this week, the most exciting thing wasn't me pretending to be in New York. The most exciting thing was the auction of a 167 million year old dinosaur. But I don't know if you can do that all the time.
So what the proof, I guess, is always going to be in the pudding. How did the actual auction do?
It was okay, Ben. I mean, I think to sell more than $300 million of art once the premium is added in a week that President Trump is in and out of hospital and we are in the middle of a virus, it wasn't bad, but I think they probably would have wanted it to have gone a bit better.
That's right. So they sort of reached low estimate, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Thanks to a dinosaur.
So let's talk about the dealers and the online viewing room. So we've heard from Louisa Buck about what's on in London. There is a dynamic series of exhibitions and everything else, but it's interesting because we're used to in this week getting sales reports from galleries at the fairs, and these are often with lots of seven-figure, maybe even more sums in them. There are sales reports emerging, aren't there? So tell me what they're telling you.
Yeah, I've just got a long list of sales. I mean, we're on day 2, I think, of Frieze's OVR, and I've got a long list of sales. I mean, Hauser and Wirth said they sold $15 million worth on day 1, including a Mark Bradford for $3.5 million, which is pretty high. But I mean, loads of galleries on this list. Tanya Benakta has sold Oliver Elias and Sarah Say, Analia Sabon, Gillian Waring from Maureen Paley at £80,000. Goodman Gallery have a Kentridge at $600,000. So it's, the sales are coming in as ever they did in a way. It's just a question of really how the galleries are using these OVRs, because it's not so different from a fair. You would always get day 1 sales, but a lot of them have been negotiated beforehand and so on and so forth. So you'd get now something a little bit different, but the galleries are using the OVRs a bit like an advert in a newspaper. I mean, unfortunately, they're our biggest competitor at the moment, Ben, at the art newspaper. They're paying £4,900 to show, and they're having to use it in a wise way.
Right. But I mean, one of the things I was wondering about all this is, does it give you greater insight into some of that sort of behind the scenes stuff that's always the subject of speculation, as in, how much of this is negotiated up front? To what extent is a booth in a fair just a very, very advanced form of advertising? Or, are real new sales made in the booths, and how many, what proportion is actually sales and what proportion is sort of pre-negotiated, all that kind of stuff? Do you feel like you're getting any insight through the OVR and the fact that the fairs themselves aren't actually happening?
I don't think I've got any more true insight, except you pointed out to me, actually, David Werner put out a list of sales this week from 3 different channels. So from the Frieze OVR, from their own website, and from their gallery show. And that is interesting. I think that people are a little more honest about from where the sales are happening. But that's as much to drive traffic to their own website, to be honest. But no, I think it's as much of a mystery. I'm still told day 1 OVR sales are this, in the same way as I was told day 1 Frieze sales are this. It's not an acceleration, it's a continuation.
And I've asked Louisa what the mood in the galleries she was visiting was like. What's the mood music from galleries, dealers that you've been speaking to, just about the health of the market?
Well, dealers are always optimistic, and I'm quite impressed by how optimistic they still are, and how active people are. But I think this week in London. I think there's a bit of a fear. I saw the art advisor Emily Singu earlier today, and there's a bit of a fear going back to the calendar that we're all kind of busy until the end of October, and then it gets awfully quiet. There's almost nothing that is happening, certainly not in Europe or the US. And so people are really, I think the fear is, okay, we're ticking by, we're okay, we have our hybrid sales and galleries, but we don't know what happens next, and we haven't seen the worst of it yet.
Right. Now, curiously, there has been an art fair happening this week, and you've been visiting it. Tell us, it's the 154 art fair. So tell us, where is it, and what does it look like?
Yeah, it's always been in Somerset House, and it is in Somerset House again. And I think, working with a place that knows how to function as an institution has probably helped it open. It's only 29 galleries, which is relatively small for an art fair, but it's great to go. It's great to see people. It's amazing to see art. I mean, I found that I'm seeing textures and noticing layers in a way I probably never used to do, because I'm so used to seeing things on a flat screen recently. I spent more than 2 hours there, which again, for 29 galleries is it's almost the inverse of what you do on an OVR. So yeah, there's ticketed entry, face masks, of course, and quite a convoluted one-way system, which is all fine. That's what they have to do. The only problem is if you've forgotten to ask someone something or take a photo of something, you have to go all the way around again. But it's fine. It's across 2 wings. They opened to VIPs at 10 o'clock this morning, and it was busy. Anita Zabladovich was there, and everyone's quite galvanized to do their best and excited to see each other. Galleries are super happy to be there. Some of them, there was a New York gallery who has a local contact in London who is manning the booth for them because they physically can't get here, or they could, but a lot of people have quarantined for 2 weeks. But yeah, everyone's pretty upbeat just to be here.
You talk about this sort of galvanisation. We've heard about the galleries' WhatsApp groups during the lockdown where they were all in touch with each other and helping each other and all that kind of stuff. Is there a sense, you think, that the art market has somehow become more of a community through all this? Or is that just the sort of headline, what the galleries want us to think, I guess?
I definitely think there's a spirit of collaboration, because it's in everyone's interest that we all do well. The bigger galleries might not want their immediate competitors to do as well as them, but they don't want people to fail right now. And you definitely don't want people lower down the food chain to fail, because that's our future. Whether or not anything has yet worked from a galvanizing point of view, I'm not sure yet. I think at the moment everyone's sort of doing what they used to do online and being a bit nicer to each other. But I think watch this space. I think there will be more things happening. I think now we've realized this isn't a temporary blip. We are going to see, I think, galleries in particular really finding ways to come together and do something that makes money.
Melanie, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about it.
Thank you very much for having me, Ben. Thank you.
You can visit our Frieze Week microsite with the latest analysis and a guide to the key events at theartnewspaper.com. Linda Yablonsky talks to Theaster Gates about his new transatlantic exhibitions in a moment, but first, here are a few of the top stories on the Art Newspaper's website this week. The rumpus over the postponement of the Philip Guston exhibition in 3 US museums and the Tate in London continues to create headlines. The directors of the Tate and the National Gallery of Art in Washington have outlined their reasons for the postponement, as Gareth Harris writes. Kaywin Feldman, director of the National Gallery of Art, told the Hyperallergic podcast that it felt like this was a tough time in America to do this exhibition, particularly at this moment, stressing that the show cannot move forward with all-white curatorial teams. Meanwhile, the directors of the Tate added in a letter to the Times newspaper in London that proceeding would not have been possible for financial and logistical reasons. France's National Assembly voted on Tuesday to pass a bill returning 27 colonial-era artefacts from French museums to Benin and Senegal, as Anna Sampson writes. If enacted, the bill would compel France to return 26 works looted from Benin's royal palace, currently in the collection of the Musée du Quai Branly-Jacques Chirac in Paris, and a sword would return permanently to Senegal from France's Musée de l'Armée. And finally, the latest postponement of an art fair. As Anna Brady writes, TAFAF in Maastricht will be delayed next year from mid-March until the end of May. TAFAF said in a statement that the move allows the global art community to more securely and safely come together in person at TAFAF and at the height of the European cultural season. You can read these stories and much more at theartnewspaper.com or on our app for iOS, which you can get from the App Store. We'll be back after this. The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. This October, Christie's will present Classic Week as a hybrid sales series with 10 live and online auctions of elegant and timeless pieces, ranging from a strong collection of Dutch landscapes and the enviable collection of decorative arts from Jane Wrightsman, to Roman marbles, a rare edition of Shakespeare's First Folio, and Louis Armstrong's trumpet. Alongside Classic Week, the Prints and Multiples department will offer an online-only sale dedicated to Francisco de Goya's Los Caprichos. Discover and bid on an array of extraordinary works that define form and standards of craftsmanship. Find out more on christies.com. Welcome back. Before we hear from Theaster Gates, don't forget to catch up with the Art Newspaper's other podcast, A Brush With, featuring in-depth artist interviews, and subscribe to hear new episodes in the coming weeks. You can do that at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you're listening now. Now, Theaster Gates has 2 exhibitions opening this week in New York and London. The 2 related shows feature works across a range of materials, including brick reliefs, paintings using tar, large-scale works in glazed and fired clay, and a number of works from his Spine series, using bound volumes of the African-American magazines Ebony and Jet. Our contributing editor in New York, Linda Yablonsky, spoke to Gates about the 2 shows and his ongoing community projects with his organisation, the Rebuild Foundation, based in his native Chicago.
Let me just say that for those who don't know, although I'm sure everyone does, Theaster has exhibited in cities all over this country, in Europe, in biennials, in galleries, and museums over the last 10 years. But this show, titled Vessel, is his first solo show in New York City. Simultaneously, somehow, through the magic of I don't know what, you're opening a show of related work the same day, this Saturday, the 10th of October, in London at White Cube Gallery. So this means at least people in New York and London both can see what you've been up to during the months of the pandemic shutdown, which seems to have been a lot.
Yeah. I mean, 6 months of non-travel, that's like 4 years. That's 4 artist years.
I mean, I've been to your studio in Chicago. I know how big it is, and I assume you have lots of assistants. But for this show, for this material, you were all alone? Is that true?
Yeah, well, the studio doesn't have lots of assistants anymore. That model no longer works for me. During this time, we've had 2 builders working with me off-site. And I really mean it, that the 6 months that was preceded by 3 or 4 months at the American Academy in Rome. And so that period of time of focused attention on a set of projects, I've not had that in this last decade. And so it meant, if I had all day to read, to say there were days I could read for the whole day and the next day, that I could conceive of whole doctoral treatises during that period. But it was just so nice to be in Rome and have a Roman day feel like 3 days, and a day of research really, really be a huge gift. And so I was able to come back to Chicago with pretty crystallized ideas that just needed to be executed, and lots of new kind of ripe convictions about what it means to be making, why making felt important to me and stuff. And so the new tar paintings came out of that.
Okay, so for the benefit of our listeners, let's talk about what exactly is in this show. There are different chapters that unfold as one goes through the gallery, beginning with I don't know. You can tell me if they're the newest works you've made or made before, the brick reliefs that are hanging on the wall in the front room of the gallery.
Yeah. So the brickworks are new. The brick reliefs are new, but the exploration in ceramics isn't new.
Okay, so let's. I would like to go through this the way one sees the show, which is beginning with one tar painting, and we'll explain that in a second. And these wall reliefs, they're abstract works made of bricks. Is this the first time you worked with brick?
Well, no. In a way, the brickwork has gone from, making small brick installations that would appear, on a pallet strapped up, kind of brick as a formalized object, a minor Carl Andre, perhaps. And then they started to evolve from hand-making bricks at the studio to being involved in a production environment with a brick manufacturer in North Carolina, where they were taking colored bricks that they weren't going to use, and they were taking all of that colored clay material, putting it in a hopper, adding additional manganese dioxide and black stain, which would make the bricks black, mixing that to extrude kind of my new black brick. And so in some ways, the brickwork is a direct engagement with like an industrial reclamation, as much as it is taking on my interest and investment in building as a way of reclaiming a space and restoring a space. So in this case, Gagosian didn't need a brick situation, but I thought when you enter the space, having these brick sculptures function as sculptures, and maybe it's just the material clay. You don't know that it's a brick. It doesn't function like a brick on the wall. That it felt like the right introduction to the rest of the exhibition.
They struck me, they're each one of these has a different arrangement, some of which they have a texture as well as a patina or a glaze, but they almost look like you've worked them by hand as you would with clay. I don't know how you got those effects, but it also reminded me or made me think of, they were like mini land art projects because they look like something you'd see from the air, flying over a piece of land, and there's suddenly this structure.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun trying to imagine the highest sculptural use for the lowest sculptural material. And so in that way, that they're bricks, but in fact, it's just clay. Clay made into a square becomes potentially a modular material. But for me, it's really like, how can I take this material and encourage it to do new things, or demonstrate that it's actually as important a material to contend with as any other material that would be in a conventional art situation. The brick can win.
Hanging with these works is one tar painting, what you call tar paintings, and tar is one of the materials you've been working with for a long time. Your somewhat autobiographical reference to your father, who was a roofer. And so I've seen some of your previous tar paintings, which were a different scale and a completely different gesture, it seems to me. And these are painted, have a pigment, enamel paint on them, as well as, they're tar paper, or not tar paper, they're torch down, you call it?
It feels necessary to kind of describe the evolution of roofing. Maybe in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, people used an asphalt paper. So they would mop the roof with hot tar, hot bitumen, and then they would lay out an asphalt kind of paper. Then they would tar over that paper, overlapping the paper. Then you would tar the entire roof after that. And it would be like putting shellac on top of a hardwood floor or something. over time, the building industry started to use a rubber material that was thicker and it was backed by tar, so that people would then take a torch the back of the roof, the rubber material, to activate the tar, and then lay that material. So it was a thicker material that was much more consistent and kind of kept the water out better. But over about, the last 5 years, I've been trying to play with this material. Like, how do I use this torch down? And realized that I could paint it and then treat the material as a kind of collage material and use my torch as a kind of adhesion device. And then we started playing again with older roofing material, torching it, heating it, pulling those parts apart, putting them back together, and then assembling essentially new painting with these old roofing materials.
The vessel themselves, the ceramic works, you started, I would say you started in life singing in the choir at your church, but pottery is what you went to school for. So working with clay was the first thing you did as an artist, but you also studied in Japan. The works in this show have references to West African sculpture as well. And you also studied urban planning simultaneously with the pot making.
Yeah, planning was the main thing, and clay was like the little side thing. I minored in studio art, but it feels important though to at least mention urban planning. And if we were to take the disciplinary title away, we would just be left with a person who studied the formation of cities and the management of cities. And the management of cities through governance and administration, whether that administration is public administration or private administration, like development corporations and councils of planning, or departments of labor, streets and sanitation. And the value of studying urban planning then is that you become a little bit of a kind of poet of the construction of cities. The city feels like a form that's malleable, but it's also, you're operating at a level of administration that's hundreds of millions of dollars a year in order to keep the city working. And so what happens when you give a potter good administrative skills to be poetically reflective on the city? Then the potter wants to brick rooms. The potter wants to build quarries. The potter wants to create wealth for the poor. You deploy those administrative skills that help you poetically reimagine the city. You can deploy those skills in super pragmatic ways.
Well, let's talk about the pragmatic ways you've done that with the Rebuild Foundation, where you have taken derelict houses on the south side of Chicago, a neighborhood that is, and beautiful.
Absolutely impeccable, filled with joy and kindness and resilience and beauty.
Well, I think you've brought that out with the houses that you've bought, renovated, and repurposed for the community with your other activity, which is collecting or collections. You bought the contents of Dr. Wax, a record store that had gone out of business, a bookstore filled with books relating to architecture, and turned them into kind of libraries accessible to the public. Most spectacularly, there's the Stony Island Arts Bank, which I visited once and have never stopped thinking about because it's amazing. It is a library. It's a reference center. And it's alive, and it has an exhibition space, and it's fascinating to look at the material there. Some of this has entered into the show I saw at Gagosian, in this tower of books, of bound volumes of, you bought the print run of the magazines from the Johnson publishing company of Jet.
And I also started hunting for Ebony and Jet magazines all over the world. I started buying out inventories in Atlanta. I became obsessive. I became a collector. I mean, I wish I could have afforded like 3 or 4 of Njideka Crosby's paintings, but I just kind of took the things that were around me. I want to just say on record that Rebuild, which I'm extremely excited and proud of, has done a lot of things, but I don't want to neglect the fact that my studio, we buy buildings. We buy buildings so that we could use them, so that when there are interns in the summer, there's a place to stay, so that if we were to have a good drink and a person needs to like crash, they don't have to crash in my bed, they can crash next door. We buy buildings to demonstrate that Black wealth is willing to invest in a Black neighborhood while it's Black. And that Black wealth isn't just in a hedge fund investing in white space, and that artists are more likely to take more risks than most other people in betting on a neighborhood, because artists are constantly creating accrued value for themselves, not just financial value. I'm talking about understanding how a building has value beyond the ability to buy it and sell it and flip it. But a building has inherent value because it means that I can do more of the things that I love, or I can store more of the things that I love, or I could care for more of the people who I love. And so I wanted to say, Rebuild and the studio have been actively restoring buildings, and in some cases, restoring them not just for some kind of grand mission statement, that you can put on a logo and get people to sympathetically give money. We're restoring them because the spaces are beautiful. And I have a fetish. I have a fetish for beautiful space, empty space, non-productive space, holy space. I don't want the work to be perceived as a missionary project. The work is actually space theory. This is Calvino. This is Lefebvre.
It's very obvious when you even not even have to be in these spaces, even just reading about them or looking at images of them, is that you come to this urban planning, let's say, this reclamation project, and you're reclaiming not just spaces or archives, but also creating or maintaining layers of history of that community and that era that would otherwise be lost, and that are so important just as a human connection, that you come to this science of urban planning as an artist, as you were saying, as a poet. And it is really different than what, an administrator would do, or a politician or an economist.
Well, Linda, this point you're making is actually quite important to me. That when we talk about the challenges that Black communities have around, Black and brown communities around the world, but particularly in the United States, if you go back and you look at all of the systematic undoing that happened, FBI scandals of them infiltrating Black organizations, pitting people against each other, assassination, crack, the influx of military weapons in poor Black places and their availability at very little cost. If you were to take all of the phenomena of that, I would say what actually happened was a kind of deep spiritual erosion, so that the family gets jacked up. You don't have the church anymore. The archdiocese is jacked. All of the social infrastructure that would have caught little Bobby and spanked him on his butt and then sent him home to mom, and mom would spank him on his butt and Bobby wouldn't do it again. All of that social infrastructure is gone. And at the same time, people are saying, this nuclear family shit is a thing of the past. Oh, God is dead. Who needs it? Oh, this is a land. Who needs to eat at home anymore? This is stupid. Hang out with and what you end up with is a seemingly sophisticated secular environment, but an environment where that all of the netted work is unnetted. And so part of the project, to me, has to be lacing back the emotional and social and spiritual webs, even in advance of sometimes new construction. So it's like, can we have a place where we just eat together or read together or just be together? And that if you can make those kinds of spaces, I actually think that it does more than people give it credit for. If someone asks me, do you think your projects are making impact? It doesn't matter. Because if you're only gauging impact by bricks and mortar, it doesn't matter. But do I think that people want to be around each other more and longer in Black space as a result of the spaces that I build? Yes. Then a person who would never consider living where I live could then say, I can see myself here. And what makes them want to say that is something that's invisible. It's not something visible. And so the work at Gagosian is also trying to get at that invisible energy that is present when cool, visible things happen.
Talking about a communal experience and nuclear families, you grew up in a family with 9 children. You're the youngest, and you're the only boy. And I would like to ask you if having 8 sisters, older sisters, in any way contributed to this worldview that you have.
Well, I mean, maybe that very thing reinforces my point that we all live together in this 4-unit apartment building that my parents owned. And my older sisters had their own apartments, But part of my survival was that building. And then another part of my wiring was these 9 or 10 personalities that were hardwiring me to love, to be kind, to respect women, to want to be better. And so I think that this idea that there was the proximity that the architecture gave us, then there was the kind of emotional richness that my sisters gave. Yeah, that makes you maybe preoccupied with things that other people aren't preoccupied with.
I would like to ask this tower of books, the bound volumes of the magazines, which are in a wooden structure with the spines on the inside, and you can enter it. And so the outside, the shelves are open, and I couldn't help it. I took one down and looked through it. Which I'm not sure visitors to the gallery can do, but it was a little like being back in the Stony Island Arts Bank and looking through the books there. I'm a white American from the North, and I grew up reading lots of magazines, and I remember being aware of Jet and Ebony, but I don't know that I'd ever actually seen one. And there was this parallel history of America in the mid-century America that I didn't know anything about. I didn't know those people. I didn't know those places. I didn't know those activities. It was fascinating, and also it made me feel small because there was so much I didn't know, and yet coexisted with what I did know, and a whole culture I didn't know about, even that was beyond music and books. It was, this snapshot of life.
Yeah, I mean, it's reasonable to say that Blackness is a parallel universe for some. I would also say that in this case, the kind of cultural specificity that the piece is called New Egypt, that New Egypt offers, it's intended to function like a kind of holy grail of the Black American experience. The floor of New Egypt is the altar center from St. Lawrence Church, and maybe in my mind the warfare that Europeans have been lauded for as Rome conquered other parts of the world. So much of that warfare included the dismantling, the burning, the pillaging of people's libraries and the assassination of their scholars, and the kind of dismantling of millennia, generations of intelligence, so that people wouldn't even know the tremendous legacy that they are inherent of, And so I think that in some ways, these two works, one, New Egypt, and then the other kind of the spine works, Walking Prayer, they're trying to talk to each other about, in this case, Carnegie's desire to see the everyday person have access to reading and literature and knowledge by setting up these libraries all over the country and in fact, other parts of the world, kind of the monopolists' commitment to pedagogy and education. And then the other truth that so much of the world's knowledge has been pillaged through warfare and the spoils of war, so that people who have had extreme knowledge might forget it in a generation. And so I think this commitment to building libraries, it feels like, it also feels like kind of intellectual impulse, emotional, spiritual impulse of a person with a pathology. That I'd like to imagine that I had the ability to rebuild the Black nation, that I would be a small part of that, but the task should no less be an ambitious task.
What is in the show in London?
London is more specifically about how I respond to the Johnson Publishing Company with new works. So this carpet remnant that is from the original Johnson Publishing Company building becomes the launching pad for a body of new spine works. There's a tribute to Joseph Albers with a series of works called Homage to the Square, which Albers was deeply invested in. In a way, it was a way of playing out his color theories through squares. And so I take on Johnson Publishing's kind of Black modernist color strategies with the Joseph Albers square in mind. So it's a text-heavy exhibition, but it's one that I'm really proud of. And the fact that these things are both manifesting at the same time, I almost wish they were both in a museum that people could get to, or I wish the galleries could even maybe talk more so that people recognize the two shows as a kind of continuum.
Thank you, Theaster.
Thank you so much.
Theaster Gates' exhibition Black Vessel is at Gagosian at 555 West 24th Street, New York, from the 10th of October to the 19th of December. His exhibition Sweet Square of Dark Abyss is at White Cube Online and Frieze Online until the 16th of October, and you can see the works in Sweet Square of Dark Abyss in real life at White Cube Bermans' viewing room. Note, you need to book an appointment. And that's it for this week. Do subscribe to The Art Newspaper at theartnewspaper.com. Click on the subscribe link at the top left of the page and you'll find a range of subscriptions. Also at the top right of the page you can find a link to subscribe to our various newsletters. And please subscribe to this podcast and A Brush With if you haven't already. Do give us a rating or review if you've enjoyed it. You can also find us on Twitter at Tan Audio and on Facebook and Instagram, of course. The Week in Art is produced by Julia Michalska, Amy Dawson and David Clack, and David also does the editing and sound design. Thanks to Louisa, Melanie, Linda and Theaster, and thank you for listening. We'll see you next week. The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Visit christies.com to find out more about the world's leading auction house since 1766. Auction, private sales, online, art, anytime.